Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to Basketball Conference, the ACC Football Podcast. My name is Joey Weaver. I'm a Georgia Tech grad and a Louisville fan. He's Mike McDaniel. He is a Virginia Tech grad and a Notre Dame fan. Mike, first question, are you riding the D train?
I was from like middle of October on.
You and Boston College as well. Yeah, the D train was quite a revelation this year for Boston College.
Left the station.
It did leave the station. Yeah, Boston College in 2017 looked pretty dead in the water, I think I would say. They were 2-4 and heading to Louisville. And that's when they found out about the D train, as it were, A.J. Dillon, and the offense really took off from there. And Boston College got real hot towards the end of the year. They went from 2-4 and they finished 7-5. They won 5 of their last 6, which was a really strong run for them. So, Mike, they finished 7-6 with a loss in the bowl game to Iowa. I had them at 5-7. You had them at 6-6. So you saw Boston College in the last game before they really caught fire as Virginia Tech 23-10 win in Blacksburg. Was there some sort of inkling there that Boston College was about to break out, or did this literally come out of nowhere in Louisville?
Kind of came out of nowhere. Yeah, I mean, I think, bigger picture, the one thing about offensive coordinator Scott Loeffler is that when he finds something that works, he doesn't go away from it. And that's, you take the good and the bad with that, right? It could be a blessing and a curse watching his offenses perform as I did in Blacksburg when he was the Virginia Tech offensive coordinator under Frank Beamer. It reminds me of the 2015 season for the Hokies when they found out they had this shiny new toy, freshman running back Trayvon McMillan, and he was running over everybody from like the NC State game that season on. And it was much similar results what we just saw with Boston College. So the fact that this ended up working out where they found out A.J. Dillon was really good and they kind of rode him through the rest of the season offensively didn't surprise me at all. That's kind of been Scott Loeffler's thing, and it worked out. To answer your question overall, was there an inkling after, BC lost to Virginia Tech that they were close? No, there really wasn't. They threw the ball a decent bit in that game, and defensively they weren't great. It was an ugly win for Virginia Tech, 23-10, and it just didn't really seem like Boston College was ever in it or really even competitive. So the fact that they would go on to win 5 out of their next 6 before the bowl game against Iowa was a complete surprise. It kind of came out of left field.
Yeah, it's very telling. If you just look at A.J. Dillon's stat lines, like where this whole thing turned around, through the Virginia Tech game, he had only gone over 60 yards once. He was getting less than 20 carries a game on average. And then yardage totals for the rest of the season, 272, 89, 149, 196, 200, 193, 157.
That'll do it.
Yeah, in the first 6 games, he had 2 touchdowns. In the final 7, he had 12. So clearly, there was a point in there where the Eagles found out something that was going to work, and then they kept going to it, which is the sign of a good offensive coordinator, which I don't know if I would go that far with Scott Loeffler. But
yeah, don't do that.
It's at least the sign of not a very dumb offensive coordinator. If that's probably not a very intelligent way of putting it, but whatever. Mike, best win. You could kind of go a couple directions with this. Boston College had a Friday night win where they absolutely beat down Florida State. That was a really impressive statement win. Of course, a down Florida State team, but at the very least, I mean, it's Boston College kicking the crap out of Florida State. Like, by itself, that's pretty impressive. I think if it's me, I'm saying the most impressive win was the 45-42 win over Louisville, that they were able to break out of this skid and really have that breakout game. That's what really sparked this whole thing down the stretch. And so at that point, Louisville's still playing okay. We talked on a previous podcast about how this wasn't a pretty loss for Louisville, and it's not good, but it doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game. Just because it was a bad loss for Louisville doesn't mean it wasn't a really good win for Boston College. And I would say that win, where it happened and what it resulted in down the stretch, I think that, to me, was the best win that Boston College had all year.
To your point, it was on the road as well, and it came out of nowhere. It really did come out of nowhere. They scored 28 against Central Michigan 2 weeks prior. They only scored 10 against Virginia Tech. Before those 2 games, they played Notre Dame at home, only scored 20 points, only scored 10 points against Wake, only scored 7 against Clemson. So it was like an offense that is pretty stereotypical of Boston College, at least in the last 10 years, 10 or 12 years without Matt Ryan. It's like, okay, offense is going to score 15 to 20 points a game, and they're going to pray that the defense produces enough stops to get the job done. And then out of nowhere, you have the 45 points against Louisville, 41 against Virginia, 35 against Florida State. Only scored 14 against NC State, but then had 39 against UConn and 42 against Syracuse. So all of a sudden, Boston College looks like one of the best offenses in the ACC. And the trigger point to that was that Louisville game. So, yeah, I'd consider that the jumping off point. I think the best win for me has to be against Florida State. I was in Blacksburg that weekend. I remember texting you, Joey, on that Friday night, and it was a screenshot of the final score. And I told you, is this real? Is this actually happening? 35-3. And I understand Florida State, all the athletes in the world completely mailed it in. I get that, but you lose by 32 points to Boston College, who couldn't score any points like 3 weeks before that. They couldn't put any points on the board. And now they're scoring 35 against a Florida State defense that, quite honestly, you and I thought was going to be one of the best units in the ACC. So I think that on paper, at least at the start of the season, I think if we had projected out and we said, yeah, hey, Florida State's going to lose to Boston College 35-3, it hands down would have been the best win. But I think for the reason you mentioned, it was the jumping off point in that Louisville game. So I completely see that as well.
Worst loss, I think there's a couple ways you could look at this too, but to me, the worst, or at least the toughest loss, I think, to swallow was the 17-14 home loss to NC State. That was the only loss in the middle of that final 6 games of the year. They were 5-1. Well, the one was a 3-point loss to NC State, 17-14. They had NC State on the ropes. We're winning the game into the fourth quarter, and then NC State scores late, and Boston College unable to get anything done before the end of the game. They had a turnover on downs in the NC State red zone with about 4 minutes left that was pretty soul-crushing to have to deal with. But I would say that was a tough loss. The other one was probably the bowl game, a loss to Iowa, 27-20. Iowa also, again, scores a late touchdown to really put the game away. So there were a couple of tough losses in there, but I think that those losses you feel a lot better about than the multi-score losses that were the first 4 of the year, 34-10, 49-20, 34-7, 23-10. Like, those are games where you're almost not even competitive. At the very least, these are games that you were competitive. It was a close game, and you almost had something. So if I'm a Boston College fan, I'm much more encouraged about the NC State and Iowa losses than any of the first 4 of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. It just felt differently when they lost those 2 games. It's like, okay, well, they played 2 pretty decent teams and just came up a little bit short versus, wow, we're not competitive against Wake Forest. And, no offense to Wake Forest. Wake Forest was excellent this year. John Wolford was great. They were a great story. I would have liked to have seen that Wake Forest game a little bit later in the year. And we see Boston College and Wake Forest. We've seen that game in late October, early November, multiple times. To see it in week 2 and to see where Wake Forest it was then and really was all year versus how BC kind of went through this swale at the beginning of the year. And then all of a sudden they came out of nowhere and they were just one of the best offenses, not only in the ACC, but in the country in the last 5 weeks of the season. I would have loved to have seen that game later in the year. That's a really tough loss to swallow because I think Boston College, as far as skill level is concerned, matches up with Wake Forest fine. Boston College doesn't match up athletically with the talent they have against Notre Dame or Clemson, so those losses are expected, even with Virginia Tech as well. But I think as far as coming up just short, that NC State loss, that's the one I think you're going to circle back to. NC State, of course, ranked. You had that game at home, and BC couldn't finish the job and really couldn't get much going all day offensively after being so great on offense 3 weeks prior to that and the 2 weeks following. I think that's the one we're going to circle back and say, man, I wish we could have had that one.
Mike, trivia time. I know how much you love trivia. I love trivia. I know that you actually hate trivia, but how many years has Steve Adazio been the head coach of Boston College?
Oh boy. Is this year 5?
This was year 5. That is correct. The actual tough trivia question here, how many of those 5 years that Steve Adazio has been at Boston College, how many of them have they gone 7-6?
4?
That would be 4 of them. That's correct again. Steve Adazio now for the 4th time in 5 years at Boston College has gone 7-6. overall, he is 2 games under 500. He's 10 games under 500 in conference. But they keep making bowl games, and they keep, getting to that 7-win plateau. Is Steve Addazio a good coach?
Man, I wrote that column in October.
Yeah, you did. You did.
I did. I said,
talk about it, Mike.
God, do we have to?
I mean, we don't have to, but
we kind of have to.
We might owe it to the people to talk about it.
Yeah. So the reason I was able to pull out the 5th season, the 4th season going 7-6 is because those are numbers that I was kind of projecting towards and referencing in that article. I thought that BC would end up at 7-6 this year when I wrote that article, and they did. Yeah, they're very mediocre every year, but I feel like they might have found something with AJ Dillon. If they had a quarterback literally at all during Addazio's tenure, this is an 8 or 9 win team pretty regularly, and it's not a team that maybe competes in the Atlantic the last few years just because Clemson's been so good, but I think it's a team that's trying to break into that top 3 or 4 in the conference, or in the division. I'm sorry. And that would be good enough, right? You get to 9 wins and you're hanging tough with Louisville or, Florida State or NC State. You're right there. You got to feel pretty good about that if you're a BC fan, especially with all the issues they've had recruiting to their facilities and they're not getting the best players they can possibly get. You take that. So is Addazio a good coach? I think he's good at coaching what he has, but I think they could do a little bit better recruiting. I thought offensively up until October they were completely inept, and it's been a problem his entire tenure there. So there's a lot that remains unanswered going into 2018. I think if the offense shows what they showed in the last 5 games or 6 games really of the regular season, and they're able to run the football as well as they did, and they get a little bit more out of their quarterback play, take pressure off their quarterback, quite honestly, I think you feel a little bit better about the Steve Addazio tenure if you're a Boston College fan. I think it really all comes down to the offense and how well they've played, because the defense has been phenomenal the entire time he's been there.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned having a good quarterback, or even a passable quarterback, I would say, pardon the pun.
Right.
We talked about at one point, I think late in the year, that if Boston College had Patrick Towles in 2017 instead of 2016, I bet you this team wins at least 2 more games. Like, this is probably like a 9-4 kind of team rather than 7-6. Boston College on the year averaged less than 6 yards per attempt passing, which is absolutely abysmal. They only had 3 games all year where they averaged better than 7 yards per attempt. Passing, that is embarrassingly bad. That's really, really bad.
Not great.
And Patrick Towles, at the very least, would give some semblance of like a deep ball threat. He could kind of push the ball down the field. And his passing numbers last year didn't even look any better than the team looked this year. But the passing numbers looked better towards the end of the season because they had a running threat with AJ Dillon. So you pair that up with Patrick Towles', cannon of an arm, and he's not perfectly accurate, but at the very least, you're getting some sort of deep ball threat that really opens things up, I think. And so I think that's very clearly the thing that this offense has been missing for years, is some sort of credible quarterback, deep ball type of threat. And yeah, the defense has been pretty good, even since losing Don Brown to Michigan a couple of years ago. They've hung in there. They've been fine. So if you're Boston College, yes, they need to be recruiting better, but I also don't know what you can really expect from this program, given where the college football arms race has gone and what Boston College has not done to keep up with that. And that's not necessarily a knock on them. It's just to say that they're not anywhere near the same class as Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, Florida State, you name it. The problem starts to arise when you have to compete with those teams in your own division, and you're not really keeping up. So I don't know who's going to do a whole lot better, and I don't know who realistically Boston College is going to go get other than Steve Addazio is going to do a whole lot better. So, I'm not looking for Boston College to fire him anytime soon necessarily, but does it leave something to be desired? Yeah, I think so. I think there is more potential here than Adazio is realizing, at least for the time being.
I want to circle back real quick on your Patrick Tolles point and having him on the 2018 or 2017 team, and even on 2018 team next year because they're returning so much talent. Patrick Tolles' strength was in the play action passing game. He would have been absolutely perfect for this offense had they realized that they had this sort of running game a year ago. It would have been phenomenal. And that was his strength, and that's what he was best at. And when Boston College played well in 2016, it was when they were able to establish a running game and give Patrick Tolles easy passing opportunities and get him comfortable in the pocket. I think on the 2017 team here, the way they ran the ball, especially in the second half of the season, if they had Patrick Tolles, I agree with you. I think this is at least 2 wins better. I think they beat NC State, and they probably win the bowl game. And, if you had this running game all the way through, you're pretty competitive with Wake Forest as well. So it's amazing. As good as the running game has been for BC here in the second half of the year, having a quarterback would have won them at least 2 more games. A competent quarterback, anyway.
Well, in talking about the zero-sum game thing, it's like, I don't know if we credit Steve Adazio and his coaching staff for figuring out that they had a run game, or you knock them for taking half the season to figure that out. Like you mentioned, I mean, you don't know what they're going to do earlier in the year against Wake Forest or some of these teams if they've figured that out beforehand. But it did take them 6 full games of 2-4 football, and getting blown out in several of those games to figure that out. So I don't really know how much you credit them or discredit them for what happened or how it happened. But at the very least, I mean, there's potential for Boston College going forward if they can tighten up the passing game a little bit, I think. Looking at 2018, Mike, UMass, Holy Cross, Purdue, and Temple is a pretty forgiving out-of-conference schedule. I think you take that every time. That's probably 2 wins to start the year. Be careful with UMass. UMass can be a little bit tricky at times, but I think it's a pretty solid out-of-conference slate in September. The problem is you've got at Wake Forest on a Thursday night mixed in the middle. I think there is a potential chance here, Mike, that Boston College is coming out of the first 5 games of September 5-0. I think that they can win any of those games. Is that more realistic, or if you're just being real here, like what do you expect Boston College to do coming out of that 5-game stretch?
I think realistically, this should be at least 4-1. I think 5-0 is realistic. I think 3-2 is realistic. UMass and Holy Cross got to win those 2 games at Wake and at Purdue. You mentioned this before we hit record. I think if Boston College has one of those 2 games at home, or even both of those games at home, you feel a lot better about it. The fact you have to play Wake Forest on Thursday night on the road is not going to be easy. I do like the fact that they have 9 days to prepare for Purdue. At least 9 days separating the 2 games. Really, you have like 8 full days to prepare, and I think you feel pretty good about that. Even though it's on the road, Purdue's a decent team. BC is going to be pretty good too, I think. And then Temple, you got to win. So I think at worst 3-2, and that would be a scenario where you drop both road games. I think all the home games in that stretch are winnable. So I think at worst you're 3-2. I think 5-0 is pretty realistic as well, but 4-1, I think, is what I'd go with, just because you have back-to-back road games in there against 2 pretty competent football teams. So, if you split there, it's not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, that's a nasty 2-game road stretch at Wake Forest on a Thursday and then at Purdue, a likely improving Purdue team. I think worst case, absolute worst case, I think you're talking about 2-3. I think they'll beat Holy Cross. I think they'll beat Temple. They should beat UMass. You never know, in-state rivalry kind of deal. I'm thinking 3-2 or 4-1. I don't think they're going to go 5-0 across that stretch. And then from there down the stretch, Mike, at NC State, home against Louisville, and then buckle your seatbelts. Home against Miami, at Virginia Tech, home against Clemson, at Florida State. 4 straight weeks. That could get ugly. And then home against Syracuse to finish the season out. You better get your winning done before November, because that 4-game stretch of Miami, Virginia Tech, Clemson, and Florida State is about as nasty as any 4-game stretch on any ACC team schedule throughout the league in 2018.
Yeah.
You're arguably playing the 2 best coastal teams and the 2 best Atlantic teams in a 4-week stretch. Like, someone hates Boston College at the scheduling office, I feel like.
I mean, at least they get 2 of them at home. I don't know. Now
Miami at home on a Friday night could get a little bit weird, so keep an eye on that one.
I agree, and BC will have a bye week before that Miami game as well. So that's, in and of itself, the Friday night game is intriguing, but the fact they have an extra week to prepare for that as well for BC, I think, makes it a little bit more interesting. At Blacksburg, I mean, BC struggles with the Hokies in Blacksburg. I will say, as weird as that Miami game is on Friday night, I think if Boston College is looking for a best opportunity to pull an upset in that 4-game stretch, I do think it's in Blacksburg against Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech's losing Virginia Tech's losing so much on defense. They're losing 2 starting linebackers. They're losing Greg Stroman and Faison and Terrell Edmonds in the secondary. They're losing Tim Settle up front. There's just a lot of changes going on that defense. And by November, Virginia Tech should have a lot of that figured out. But on paper, at least going into the season, Virginia Tech losing as much as they are on defense, I think that's a game that Boston College, if they're able to get things going in the running game, it could be a little bit more difficult for Virginia Tech to win that game than most, just because BC can keep the ball out of the Hokies' hands and that sort of thing.
Hey, fair enough. You know more about it than I do.
Hey, and they got Clemson and Florida State the following 2 weeks, and I don't feel good about either of those 2 games if I'm a BC fan. Because Florida State's going to actually want to play for Willie Taggart next year, and Clemson's going to be the best team in the country. So that's where we're at.
You know what the schedule looks like to me, Mike?
7-6.
7-6 looks like a 7-6 kind of schedule.
Yep.
I think they'll be able to beat Louisville at home. They beat them this year. I think it's going to be even better at home this year. I think they'll beat Syracuse. They'll probably finish somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Division. But that is a nasty 4-game stretch, and I'm guessing they're going to lose another one here or there throughout the schedule. So, yeah, I think it feels pretty safe to go 7-6 at this point. Is that fair?
Yeah, and regardless of whether or not that 7th win comes in a bowl game or regular season, it's semantics at this point.
Yeah. Well, we know the point that this is all converging towards. So, that's it. Mike, anything else in Boston College? What's that?
They'll have a good team next year.
Yeah, they'll be pretty good. But again, they play in the Atlantic Division, and that's where a rising tide is lifting. Wake Forest and Syracuse might be better one of these years. We'll see. It's a bad year to draw Miami out of on the cross divisional game. Going to Purdue, not ideal at this point. This schedule is trickier than it should be in a lot of years, just because of the way that a couple of these teams are kind of rising and falling. So, again, another situation where Boston College might be good and or better than they were in 2017, and they might have the same or a worse record. I mean, that's a possibility here. Mike, anything else in Boston College before we get out of here?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, we're going to go recap some more teams. In the meantime, y'all can find us on Twitter. I am at FTRS Joey. He is at Mike McDaniel ACC, and together we're at BC Podcast ACC. You can send us an email with your questions, comments, concerns, whatever you want, to the longest email address known to man, basketballconferencepodcast@gmail.com.
Nailed it.
You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, the Overcast app, wherever fine podcasts are sold for free. Mike, tell them where they can find us on the social medias.
They can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/basketballconference. Rate, review, find all of our podcasts there, Joey.
They can, and they should, and they have been, and we appreciate that very much. Facebook.com/basketballconference. You can also find us on YouTube now. We have our own channel on YouTube if you want to come watch us talk about stuff rather than just listening to us talk about stuff. Just search for Basketball Conference. We don't have a fancy URL or anything, so you'll have to go find our channel, but we'll have videos of our, these little conversations we're having on Skype. They'll be posted there. Go find them. Go hit the subscribe button. I think if you get to like 100 subscribers, you get a fancy URL. So one day, pie in the sky. Mike, anything else before we get out of here and go recap some more teams?
I think we're all set, babe.
I think so too. This has been a good 20-minute Boston College recap. So dilly. Well, for that guy over there, Mr. Mike McDaniel, I am Joey Weaver. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll talk to you again soon. And until next time, go ACC.